Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our event, Feminist Framing of Europeanization, Gender Equality Policies in Turkey and the European Union. My name is Beste İşleyen. I'm a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm really happy to be chairing this important event today. So this event is part of the ACES series, Gender and Sexuality in European Geopolitics, which is coordinated by Dr. Hannah Müllenhoff, who is also a panelist today. And we have two speakers to address the question of how can we rethink the theory and practice of Europeanization from a feminist perspective. So this event specifically discusses the recently published edited collection by our two speakers, which is entitled Feminist Framing of Europeanization, which came out with Palgrave this year in 2021. And this edited volume explores gender policies and addresses challenges surrounding the EU's impact of domestic politics with a specific focus on Turkey. So today we are very happy to host the two editors of this book, and I'm going to introduce our speakers now. So our first speaker is Dr. Rahime Süleymanoğlu Kürüm, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul. She is also an associate member of the Nottingham Interdisciplinary Center for Economic and Political Research. Her research focuses on Europeanization, EU foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, gendering EU studies, and gender diplomacy. She is the author of Conditionality, the EU and Turkey, From Transformation to Retrenchment, which came out in 2019. And our second speaker is Dr. Melis Cin, who is a lecturer in education and social justice at Lancaster University in the UK. She's a feminist researcher with a particular interest in exploring the relationship between education, peace, and international development. She has been very productive in terms of volumes. So some examples, she's the author of Gender Justice, Education and Equality, Creating Capabilities for Girls and Women's Development, which came out with Palgrave in 2017. And she has two co-edited volumes. The first one is entitled Youth, Gender and the Capabilities Approach to Development, which came out in 2018 with Routledge. And the second book is entitled Post-Conflict Participatory Art, Socially Engaged Development, which is forthcoming this year with Routledge. And I'm also really happy to introduce our discussant today, the coordinator of this series, Dr. Hannah Müllenhoff, who is an assistant professor of European Studies with a focus on Europe in the world. Hannah's research focuses on the EU's external relations from a feminist perspective, and she mainly is interested in the EU's women's and LGBTQ rights promotion in Turkey, as well as the EU's security and defense policies. Anna is one of the coordinators of the US's research network, Gendering EU Studies, and also a member of the executive committee of the Council of European Studies' Gender and Sexuality Studies Research Network. And Hannah has recently co-edited a special issue for Political Studies Review with the title of Sleeping Off or Turning the Tide, Gender Equality in EU External Relations in Times of Crisis. So I'm really excited to hear more about the book and also the Hannah's discussion. So our speakers will have 20 minutes in total, which will be followed by a discussion by Hannah for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then I will open the floor for the Q&A. So you can use the Q&A box to send us our questions, and we will look forward to hearing from you in terms of questions and comments. So Melis or Rahime, who wants to start?
I will start. Shall I start?
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. You can hear me well, right?
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Rahime Süleyman Okurum. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations. First of all, I would like to thank Beste for this nice introduction, and also I would like to thank Hanna for organization and invitation. I'm truly happy to have the opportunity to present our work to you today. So before I start, I would like to express where this idea of this book came about and how it has evolved. This book is an output of our Jean Monnet module together with Melis Jin, which we have completed in August 2020, called Women's Development and Europeanization of Gender Policies. With this project, we sought to elaborate the domestic impact of the EU on gender equality policies by combining the expertise of myself on Europeanization and Melis on gender studies. So this book came out as an output of our first workshop held in April 2018, but it has evolved since then with the insights from our contributors and several discussions as a follow-up this event. So it's an output reflecting accumulation of this years of work since the application for this Jean Monnet module funded by the European Commission. So one thing that that is very valuable for both for me and Melis is that we selected our participants through open calls, so we did not commission chapters. So we came to know about our contributors during this phase. So we went for open calls and then in relevant networks and directly by directorate across all universities in Turkey. So apart from combining our expertise on gender and EU, our preparations for the module have also revealed that the EU appears to be an important actor in promoting gender equality. It's been on the agenda since the Treaty of Rome, and its legislative template had expanded in 1970s and again in 1990s, particularly towards and in the aftermath of Beijing Platform for Action, which was adopted in 1995 in the World Women Conference organized by the UN. So we were particularly interested to observe the EU's documents and conditionality toward target countries incorporating gender equality agenda as part of human rights and democratization. So this was one of the puzzles that we wanted to focus on in building our feminist framework. So when we reviewed the literature on Europeanization of gender equality policies, what is good is that there is an extensive and rapidly growing literature. And we particularly focused on the literature on Europeanization of non-members. So our research was directed how the EU promoted gender equality in Central and Eastern European states, but also the European Neighborhood Policy region, where different forms of association exist. So this literature has provided us a number of answers to the question of the extent to which the EU promotes gender equality. So answers were diverse and ranged from the EU's failure as a normative gender actor, as indicated by a recent work from Chapal and Guarina, that it is actually a gender normative actor. So but when we look at the literature, we observe that the EU was perceived to be successful in promoting legislative changes, but there has been a rhetoric implementation gap. So we can summarize the EU's impact on gender equality policies with Zartalov's argument that EU achieved as considerable but not transformative changes. So at the very basic sense, it provided a legitimate ground for domestic actors, epistemic communities and democrats to layer on the EU conditionality and the legitimacy provided by that to defend their agendas more effectively. Apart from the literature, we have been puzzled by a report published by the European Parliament's Policy Department for Citizens' Rights and Constitutional Affairs in 2019, revealing a backlash in gender equality and women's rights in 6 EU member states, namely Austria, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. So our immediate assessment and reflection was a confirmation of the findings in the literature, arguing that the EU's ability to trigger considerable but not transformative change. And these countries appear to have ticked boxes for legislation in order to comply with the EU membership criteria, and when membership award is received, then they had no further motivation to work for gender equality and women's empowerment. And also, on the other hand, we have seen that the EU has also failed to trigger social learning at the governmental level and also at the societal level. So we observe this backlash. So this argument is important, but it's not entirely convincing to us, as member states have intensive political dialogue among each other. And the EU funds a lot of projects to promote gender equality, and then it promotes its gender equality as part of its identity. So at this point, we have this rapidly growing and impressive literature on gender in EU studies that provides a number of answers which are important to analyze why the EU could not generate sustainable changes in the lives of women and girls. So the focus has been on the domination of economic concerns, with limited attention given to inequalities in the private sphere, and the EU's prioritization of socio-economic reforms on gender equality and in the accession process. And another popular answer is that domestic societal factors or the receptiveness of the EU's norms in the domestic context. So while this literature was very important and enriched our understanding of the factors mediating the EU's positive impact, a number of systematic analysis and more systematic analysis and theorization is needed to understand why the EU is unable to trigger sustainable changes that brings significant improvements in the lives of women and girls. And so in order to achieve this very objective of developing a feminist framework for Europeanization so that we can explain the entirety of the domestic change in gender equality policies, we wanted to take a non-member state, a candidate country, where credibility of the membership perspective still exists, even though it's contested from time to time. So we have chosen Turkey not only because of our knowledge of the context, but also beyond that, it offers a robust case to develop a feminist framing, because it's a perfect case that qualifies actually as the most likely case, because of the length of its relations with the European Union that started in 1959 with the application of associate membership, which gives us, the opportunity to test the various variables within the Europeanization framework in a longitudinal way. And we also consider as a most likely case because gender equality has a special importance in Turkey and considered by political and bureaucratic elites as an emblem of Turkey's identity and modern European identity and modernization. And beyond this, we should not forget the strong feminist movement in Turkey, even at times of undemocratic regimes and political instability. So that gives us a framework, to elaborate and explore what has been missing without actually being distracted by different social, legal, and cultural factors. So we wouldn't be able to achieve this exploration by studying different case studies, different country cases. So this gives us an opportunity to develop a feminist framework with that. So our contribution is that from the findings of your applications in the case of Turkey, we identify that the EU needs to develop a feminist agenda. We illuminate the limitations of the Europeanization pathways and argue that EU should they should be updated with a feminist consciousness. And Melis will talk more about how a feminist framework of Europeanization should look like with the insights from feminist philosophy. With this opportunity, I would like to introduce our structure in the edited volume. So we have two parts in our volume. I'm not going to go into detail, but part one is our conceptual framework dealing with the enlargement strategy of the European Union, the EU's promotion of gender equality in foreign policy, feminist criticisms of the Europeanization, along with the identification of the EU conditionality on Turkey, and the frame analysis of the EU's funding documents on Turkish civil society. And the part two moves into our empirical analysis, ranging from the EU's impact on women's rights and feminist movements, its impact on political representation of women, fights against violence against women, gender response implementation and adoption of gender responsive budgeting, gender equality in the private sector, education and asylum policies. Finally, at my part, in order to explore empirical subcases within gender equality policies, we provided our contributors with a guideline to conceptualize different occurrences of changes and continuities in gender policies. So we did so together with Didem Soyalt and Colella by identifying 3 models driven from conditionality and social learning mechanisms, interest-driven, norm-driven, and lesson-driven models. And we identify the domestically triggered lesson-driven model from the perspectives of these 2 theoretical approaches. And we also provided our contributors with 2 outcomes as to identify and conceptualize the EU's impact. One is norm adoption, which means transposition of the EU legislation and domestic context into the domestic context, and as well as the administrative changes adopted in compliance with the EU. And the second is norm application, which means actual or effective implementation of gender equality legislation and real improvements in the lives of women and girls. And we also wanted to operationalize each of these dimensions with 3 types of operationalization. So we defined positive, negative, or selective changes, and we asked our authors, contributors, to reflect on what type of change that we are going to, what is the quality of change that is hindered, and so we developed alternative explanations from feminist philosophy and tested them in our exploratory case study of Turkey. So this is all from my end. Thank you very much for your attention. I think Melis will talk more about our feminist framing and Europeanization, how it should look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahima. Hi, everyone. This is Melis speaking. So in this book, one of the key questions that we seek to respond is whether the EU could be a feminist actor. And we did this through looking at empirical cases, as Rahima has outlined. And we use the theoretical lens that we developed in this particular book. And I will now focus on that theoretical arguments of our work. But before I go through the theoretical argument, I want to say that I will first offer a feminist critique of interest and norm-driven models, which Rahima has briefly mentioned. But I want to highlight that our feminist critique draws on the work of feminist philosophers such as Honora O'Neill, Carol Patman, Martha Nussbaum, and Nancy Fraser. And I'll just, as I present, I'll just speak how they come into play with one another. So starting with the interest-driven model, we ask the question of whose interests are at stake and represented. So when adapting the directives, the leaders in parliaments can be gender blind, and more importantly, norms can impose and intensify the white male hegemony of domestic elites. And it is often forgotten that the policies and directives can have different outcomes for women and men if they're not driven by a gender responsive rationale. So another related question that comes in relation to interest-driven model is that what is rational and for whom? So the fundamental problem that lies with the interest-driven models assumption of rationality and the gender-related implication of this assumption corresponds to the issue of interest and representation in the feminist philosophy. So Shapiro raises the question of the degree to which and under what circumstances are political institutions and decision makers responsive to female citizens. Actually, this argument is skeptical about the knowledge and policies developed by gender-blind institutions, as they can enforce gender stratification in the long run. And it is also important to emphasize that interest can be driven by the ideologies of governing parties, which may not necessarily support the cause of gender equality. And the increased conservatism and the right-wing populism you see in Europe, for instance, in Hungary, Poland, and also in Turkey, have actually produced a traditional understanding of gender that rests on the idea of neoconservatism, which ascribes the central locus of women as being the family. So even if we assume that women's interests are addressed in this model, we should remember that women are not homogeneous or all the same, and the interests of women may vary depending on their ethnicity, race, class, and sexuality, and therefore we should account for such differences and intersectionalities. So moving to the norm model, we find its discussion we focus on 3 variables, and we find these 3 variables problematic from a feminist lens. They're the gendered nature of interactions of the EU-sponsored networks, legitimacy arguments, and multidimensional and multi-level understanding of norm resonance. So just to make the briefly case for it, the precondition of interacting in the EU-sponsored networks is problematic because, as Chappell argues, this socialization is often based is often dominated by gendered logic of appropriateness or the masculine ideal. And today, if we look at the breakdown of the ministries of the EU member states, we could see that women are clustered predominantly in socio-cultural matters such as health, education, social affairs, or family and sports. So this male dominance is reproduced through different mechanisms of power and contract, as Carol Patman argues. And the sexual contract approach of Patman posits how men occupy authoritative and decision-making roles in politics, economy, or judiciary, and how men position women to earn less and be less involved in the public space through allocating them the duties of housework and childcare. So the gender equality norms promoted by the EU may not resonate with the domestic norms of individual countries as well. So that this means political elites in the target countries may be motivated to adopt appropriate gender equality policies to get the incentives from the EU, but not necessarily implement them as they clash with the ideas and beliefs widely embedded in their cultures and traditions. And a good example of this is the actually arbitrariness around the LGBT rights in the EU. So, and there may be cases when the incompatibility of the EU norms can further marginalize women. For instance, when local women's groups are pushed to frame their activities to comply with the priorities of the EU funding, certain or a Western, let's say, a feminist gender equality that may not resonate with the norms of the target country are actually being imposed on them. For instance, if you look into research in Turkey and also the chapter written by Büke Boşnak, we can argue that the EU does not always account for the domestic and local issues of Turkish society, and the EU funding therefore does not allow for civil society organizations to design their own local agendas. So based on these criticisms, going forward, Rahima and I came together to understand how a feminist Europeanization should look like. So doing this, we're drawing on a more a normative feminist theorization, and we're arguing for a more ethical and moral and ethical philosophical understanding. So we, drawing on the literature and on the feminist philosophers' work in engagement with our context, we draw 4 important principles. So first, we advocate deeper understanding, which concerns for qualitative indicators such as women's roles in decision-making, and looking into issues like who benefits from the policy outcomes and labor market opportunities. The questions of who the justice is for, meaning who is being represented, extends the debate to the question of how in identifying the who of justice. So this kind of a metapolitical injustice outlined by Fraser is an outcome of state and transnational elites' monopolization of the frame of representation. And in this book, when we look into the empirical case by Burcu Taşkın, we can see that Turkey currently has one of the highest number of women parliaments, women MPs in the parliament. Yet because of the strong party discipline and polarization, there is not substantial representation, and women MPs do not act for women or represent women's interests, as can be seen in abortion rights and Istanbul Convention debates. Secondly, we critique the approach of treating women's rights as human rights and argue that gender equality should be based on equality of outcomes, opportunities, and substantive positive negative freedoms. I mean, gender equality policies of the EU have mostly been driven via a human rights framework that aims to provide a very strong language in directives. Yet we all know that granting equal rights does not necessarily empower women, as they're not considered equal partners to men in democracies. And it also doesn't deconstruct the power dynamics, hierarchies, and gender inequalities that deprive women exercising from their so-called rights. So it is forgotten that legalistic solutions improve women's lives to only a limited degree, because many countries grant rights in a rhetorical sense. And here, what we argue is that the measure should consider whether the women have access to these rights, and should involve transformation in social institutions that perpetuate these gender inequalities. For instance, the African analysis of gender equality in the private sector by Mine Afacan Fındıklı in the empirical case of the book show that women, even at higher women managers, even at top levels or higher levels, couldn't benefit from non-discrimination legislation which was passed in Turkey due to lack of implementation, and they found themselves fighting against issues of gender pay gap and sexual harassment, which shows that how equal rights do not translate into equal outcomes. So therefore, an ideal feminist framework should draw on the principle of achieving equality of outcomes and opportunity, and should ask the question of equality of what, raised by Amartya Sen in his capabilities approach. So when we ask this question of equality of what in a feminist debate, our response surely goes beyond equality and surely goes beyond the equality of rights or equality of what one can achieve. Here, the equality of rights cannot have extensive implications for how women exercise these rights, because their choice and freedoms are affected by personal factors such as age, gender, disability, or physical environment, policies, practices, or public arrangements. So one can rightfully ask the question of what the point of having abstract rights is if you cannot secure whatever it is you have. So the EU should do more than passing legislation in order to ensure that they see rights as normative rather than inspirational. So our third argument aims at the EU being a more constructive actor. So the framing of gender equality in southern neighborhood, particularly in Middle East, actually shows that EU's intervention takes place in the form of white women teaching other ethnic women their rights, and white men teaching other ethnic men how to respect their women. So as Kunz and Meisenbacher's argument, drawing on their argument, we could basically say that the EU's produced as a masculine protector in an entirely patronizing and patriarchal tone in such settings. And this implies a limited understanding of gender equality on the part of the EU and its approach to women in other countries as tools to secure its economic and security interests, but failing to engaging with the quality of women's lives and gender equality concerns in the neighboring countries. And that's where also takes us into the argument of feminist institutionalism, which I will not go in detail in this presentation. But lastly, our last argument is that we argue any gender equality policy should be governed by the principles of redistribution, recognition, and representation dimensions of justice described by Nancy Fraser's feminist politics. So these dimensions cannot be reduced to one another, and they refer to the political, economic, cultural discursive, and political erroneous. So it is not, it's also important to recognize that this kind of, these feminist claims may impinge on one another. For instance, if a redistributive policies aimed at single mothers may result in a misrepresentation of women having lesser value in society due to the androcentric devaluation of caregiving, if they're not joined with struggles for cultural change or that revalue the care work itself. So just to wrap up, embracing a broader gender equality understanding based on these three dimensions can only make Europeanization process and agenda more gender equal, and make EU, can potentially make the EU a feminist sector. So going back to the question that we asked at the beginning of this presentation, we argue that unless driven by a feminist understanding and by moving beyond the liberal concerns of feminism to consider issues such as recognizing the links between gender regimes, power structures, and relations, the EU will remain a progressive actor for gender equality, as it aims to improve women's rights and lives by correcting practices and policies without disrupting the underlying gender structures and power relations that generate them. So unless EU is a feminist actor committed to transformative changes within its borders and beyond, being a progressive gender actor at a rhetorical level will be an insufficient attempt to build a gender equal Europe. So this was the end of my case for making a feminist sort of a critique and a claim for Europeanization. So I'll just now stop here and pass it to Hannah, who will just reflect on this work.
Well, thank you, Rahime and Melis, for this extremely clear and comprehensive introduction. I very much look forward to reading the entire volume, and I especially want to praise your skills, both of you, in providing us with so much content in 20 minutes. That's a skill I would like to praise before moving to Hannah. Thank you. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beste. Thank you so much for chairing this event and for the kind introduction. And thank you, Melis and Rahime, for being here and for sharing your book project with us today. And it's really a pleasure to be here and discuss it with you. And I've read this book with really great interest. It's very impressive and it's very timely and a much needed volume on Turkey, and Europeanization. And although there's a lot of literature on Europeanization and also increasingly de-Europeanization in the context of Turkey, but also in other contexts, there has really been no serious reconsideration of Europeanization from a feminist perspective. And you really show that this has long been overdue. And to be honest with you, I felt a little bit stuck or I don't know, maybe tired of this Europeanization literature in the past years. And this book really, I think, sets the right tone. It gives us a lot of new food for thought to think about Europeanization. And I think really this is brilliant. And of course, a feminist reframing of Europeanization is much more critical and much more skeptical engagement, I think, with the effects of the EU on third countries. And it can, of course, inform our understanding of the limits of Europeanization, I think, in a much more complex way than we have seen before. And it enables an account of Europeanization and its relationship to also maybe rising authoritarianism, as you point out, and backlash against gender and sexuality policies within the EU more broadly. So it's certainly relevant beyond the case of Turkey and extremely timely. I want to maybe point out one of the chapters that one of you have been also involved in, the chapter on the Europeanization of education policy. Melis, you've been involved in that. And I really especially like that chapter very much. You didn't present this here now, of course, but for everybody, I recommend reading the book anyway. I really like that chapter very much because it studies also the absence, in a sense, of Europeanization, in a sense, a very feminist thing to study the absences. And it studies the EU's absence from this policy field to quite an extent, but also shows the complex nature of what constitutes Europeanization. So, of course, it's not such a clear top-down process coming from the EU. There are other also international actors involved that kind of it's interacting or resonating or contradicting themselves. There's a messiness of different rationales and of actors, also their domestic struggles that are playing out here. And I think we can see this very clearly in education policy in Turkey and also with the EU. And it also greatly demonstrates a point you are trying to make also in your outline, how gender equality policy in the EU, but also in Turkey, is constituted by market logics. And it's about making girls' education a way to produce human capital and make them participate in the labor market. And that's actually something we see, I think, both in the EU's and Turkey's policies. Sometimes a little bit of critical note here. I think some of the chapters could go a little bit further and engage actually a bit more strongly with your theoretical framework, and going, beyond asking whether policies are gender sensitive or what the outcomes would mean for women, and questioning a bit more how Europeanization and EU policies that are diffused are gendered, without just focusing on gender policies, but maybe looking at policies where we don't expect gender maybe to see this clearly. And I'm thinking maybe about security policy, but also you have one chapter on migration policy, and I think that's also, of course, very relevant. And here, I think I would try to think a little bit more about what does it mean that such policies would be gender sensitive, because especially when it comes to migration policy, even if there was gender sensitivity in the EU-Turkey deal, I don't think it would make this a feminist policy. So that's, I think, questions to discuss. But actually, your, I think, framework that you presented here invites us actually to ask these questions and to go much beyond these kind of more looking for gender or gender sensitivity. And this is what you presented here before. This is your chapter 4 in the book, where you develop your framework. And I think this is very innovative and really interesting, and really moves the debate on Europeanization forward. And as you pointed out before, you criticized this interest-driven model of Europeanization by asking whose rationality and whose interests are actually central here when we think about interest-driven Europeanization. I think that's a very important question to ask here. And you also question the norm-driven model by suggesting that the social interactions that are part of Europeanization processes are also highly gendered. And if you look at the institutions, etc., we of course can clearly see that. And you argue that we should have a more normative approach instead of this instrumental approach. So it shouldn't just be about gender equality for including more women in the labor market, for instance, or for achieving more security, etc. And you also provide a critique of a human rights approach and instead suggest to focus on the equality of outcomes. And I think this is super relevant and interesting when we look at the EU's engagement with third countries and its focus on human rights, which is obviously kind of part of the EU's, I don't know, identity, if you will. And this is such a relevant point because, as you point out, we can observe how the EU's human rights approach is very limited also as it kind of isolates questions of gender in kind of a silo and doesn't really ask these questions how policies are gendered in a more comprehensive way. It also ignores differences and intersectionality, as you also mention in your chapter. Maybe I would add here that it also creates categories that might not always resonate in other countries or in other contexts. So we know this, for instance, from research on LGBTQI rights promotion, that here international actors intervene in context and create this category of LGBTQI rights that might not actually exist in such a sense in this specific context, and that can actually also create more harm than good. And in that sense, the EU is actually reproducing heteronormativity by promoting LGBTQI rights and creating kind of a situation that could actually be more damaging for marginalized people. And I think this is also linked to your third point, where you criticize the EU for what I would call a neo-colonial, or you, I think, call it also paternalistic approach to gender equality abroad. And you kind of point out how the EU kind of as this masculine protector is trying to teach others, etc., etc. And I'm wondering, this is now some questions for you, if you consider these 3 points together, a more normative approach, a less human rights focused approach, how can we reimagine Europeanization from a feminist and maybe post-colonial lens? And here I'm thinking more also about the relationship between the EU and others. What does that mean for this relationship between the EU and Turkey in the specific case? And the ideas of a relational approach is basically at the heart of a feminist theory. So I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on this. And I think this is maybe also linked to one of your suggestions that I really love, where you say that we need to reestablish the EU institutions through a feminist rationale. And I would love to hear more what your ideas or thoughts or concepts are for such a reimagination of EU institutions through a feminist rationale. And this leads me to my last point, which is a very broad point. And this goes a little bit back to, I think, my unease with this idea of Europeanization in the past years, which is, I'm wondering, should we really call it still Europeanization and de-Europeanization? And this is really an open question. So should we have Europe as a reference point? How can we avoid the danger of Eurocentrism if we stick to this vocabulary? And does it allow us to make the moves that you want to make to have this feminist reframing? And is it also still useful, even if the EU itself is not committed to the feminist policies that we would maybe like to see or we would consider feminist? And then maybe you could reflect on how you see this in the current Turkish political context. You already mentioned, for instance, how gender equality is also such a strong marker of Turkish Europeanness and Westernization. So this could also actually maybe rather reinforce this polarization. And you pointed to the strong the tradition of the feminist movements in Turkey. If you think about these questions and then maybe reconsider whether it's so useful to think of Europeanization and de-Europeanization or not. But this is really an open question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for presenting your book, and I'm looking forward to what you say.
Thank you, Hannah. That was an excellent contribution, so many relevant questions. And I think there is a lot of things in Hannah's contribution, and maybe you would like to react to it or some of the aspects. And in the meantime, I would like to invite our audience to send us their questions. You can use the Q&A box to send our speakers the remaining questions that you might have. Melis and Rahime, do you want to react to Hannah's intervention?
Yeah, I can start with a couple of points that just like I've noted down. I mean, thank you so much, Hannah. You have done such an amazing and a comprehensive, like job of unpacking so many things, and which are all very relevant. I'm so glad that we're recording this, so because I would really love to go back and listen to them. And so, given the frame time, I won't be able to, sort of address all of those issues, but it's just like it's small points that as a point of iteration. So actually, the question of asking whether we should take to Europe as a reference point is a very valid one, because when we were working on these chapters, that was the question that we were asking always with, discussion with Rahima as well, because EU sees, like herself as a teacher of gender equality, like as a promoter of gender equality, but actually, what happens both on the ground when you look into the civil societies, so I mean the feminist movements, the civil society movements, the way that NGOs operationalize is that, I mean, particularly the IPAs has been very much sort of important in terms of expanding the civil society in Turkey. And what we see is that the particular understanding and the particular agendas imposed by particular gender equality norms imposed by the European counterpartners, have often left these NGOs to be like a service providers rather than initiating any kind of a transformative gender equality change at the grassroots level, or really bringing transformative changes and being them, sort of important actors that could transform the mindsets. And these were sort of I think these were a lack of a dialogical, like a Socratic talk, maybe a lack of a Socratic talk between the EU and the Turkey, and maybe, like in Turkey, really like a feminist researcher, or, like a sort of the feminists who have sort of work on the fields or for so long, that this lack of this Socratic understanding or Socratic dialogue led into a very much a relationship that is based on a power hierarchy, where, like the civil society delivered whatever the EU said without necessarily attuning the gender concepts into, or gender equality into their own context, understand without necessarily understanding this. I mean, I know that the coloniality concept does not work in Turkey, so I don't want to say it, but the decoloniality about gender in terms of understanding how those gender norms are attuned into Turkish context. So this is one of the issues that we were also discussing throughout the book, like whether EU can, like should be much more open in terms of a dialogue of understandings of how certain gender norms, there are some certain gender values that's just like we share across the university, but some certain gender norms that needs to be sort of maybe compromised, discussed, and prioritized in one settings more than the others. So this is an important point that we need to also look into. And regarding the feminist, I just want to say one thing about the feminist institutionalism, and then I will just like give it to Rahima actually. So our point about feminist institutionalism is that we find that, sort of institutional reforms, this also includes the institutional reforms done in Turkey, can be very resistant to gender structures, or they can have an inclusion of a feminist perspective, and this kind of leads to only paying lip services. So it's more like an add woman and stir approach. And this kind of an approach actually does not take us very well anywhere, and it does not really implicate itself in a much more meaningful change in women's lives, but only more like a numerical parities of ensuring that more women joins the labor market, or more women goes to higher education, these kind of things. But actually what is necessary, I think, both in Turkey and in the EU itself, is that re-establishment of institutions through adopting a feminist rationale, because this is much more likely to bring change rather than adding gender perspective without deconstructing the underlying framework that generates these kind of mindsets as well. And this just like should start, maybe one of the ways that you know, I always think that this should also start from the, you know, Ministry of National Education, because this is where everything goes back to the moment you have all these, you know, the way that you raise children, the way that these curriculum, the way that these textbooks are also devised are very much in a gender biased way, and it becomes a problem very much in like early on as even in kindergartens, that, you know, how we understand the certain gender codes and norms in the society. So I'll just stop here, and I'll just like ask Rahima to continue.
Thank you very much. I will also start from the reverse order of the questions that Hannah raised. Thank you very much, Hannah. You made an amazing job, and thank you very much for all your contributions. And yeah, I will also start with this idea of, you know, reimagining institutions, and, you know, also move to avoiding Eurocentrism. Okay, so first of all, you know, what are our findings in the empirical chapters? And of course, we started with this framework, and it's now a new passion for me, this deconstructing, and I'm also writing another paper on decolonizing knowledge on EU-Turkey relations. And so this is something that is real and important to ask. We are not particularly answering this question, but at least, you know, developing bringing a new insight on, you know, criticizing this approach of the European Union from a feminist lens, because European Union, at least at different levels, both in Turkey and also looking at the literature, it was important, I mean, to at least to bring legislative changes. And it cannot move beyond that, and it can lead to backlash. And that is the reason is that, as we can see, the various issues related to representation. And I think this reimagining the institutions is very maybe strong point, but also very important point, we think, because, you know, I have a research on, you know, also gender and diplomacy, where our first female diplomat comments that I am being a woman and man at the same time to justify her presence in diplomacy. So basically, when you actually add these women in this, you know, male-dominated institutions, even though their ratio is 50-50, you know, that leads to a lot of performances of different types of femininity, hegemonic masculinity or pariah femininity. So it doesn't really lead women to act for women. And this is what we also see in one of our contributors, Burcu Taşkın's analysis, that, you know, women even initiated legislation that was against the women's interests. And so unless, you know, we have actually stick with these institutions and reform them, we are doing this add woman and steer approach that is not going anywhere, but even strengthening all these masculine structures dominated in these institutions. And beyond that, Hannah also asked about, like, how can we reimagine Turkey's like relations of the European Union with other countries, also Turkey? I mean, if the EU achieves, you know, these kind of like adopting a feminist rationale in its promotion of gender equality, it could actually achieve more. I mean, it has the potential to trigger certain changes. And where it fails, the successes we observe in our empirical chapters that rely mostly the role of femocrats. So, you know, with the femocrats, you know, the funding to civil society, and also the conditionality from above, so they can look in the government to positive change. The problem where they fail is that it's imposing their own agenda that doesn't really comply with the requirements or the priorities of the nation, you know, the society in terms of gender equality. That doesn't really help to bring sustainable changes, but it has the potential, we think, and I think when our analysis of literature on post-communist Europe and also in Turkey have achieved a lot, you know, at least provided legitimacy. But this legitimacy is kind of like stuck somewhere, it's limited. You know, when you actually ask this question, okay, how the implementation matters, then the Turkish authorities will, of course, will look at Europe. So what happens in Austria? What happens, you know, in Hungary today? So then, you know, you have no answers as the European Union, as the teacher of gender equality, as one institution that is strong and important to promote gender equality as part of its identity. You have no answers in here. And also, you know, any kind of measures, quotas and everything, you see the examples, and then, you can't really respond as the EU authorities to, to trigger further changes, as you are not implementing yourself, because you are basically approaching this issue of like gender equality as an instrument to achieve economic development or democratization, not an objective in itself, but an instrument to further objectives. And also, I like the question about the chapters not written, so maybe the touching upon others such as security. That would be really good. I mean, so some of the chapter, I mean, we could have more policy areas, but this is, such a new area to cover, and we wanted to really focus on one single country because of the reasons that I mentioned. And we went for open calls, and we would be really happy to receive some chapters on security, but we didn't receive anything. It will be really good. Maybe it's something for further research in the future. Yeah, I don't know if I missed any point, but please ask if I have missed. Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you, Rahima and Melis. We still have a few minutes for the questions, but now I do not see any question in the chat box. But I have questions myself, and maybe I use this as an opportunity to ask them. So I was wondering whether any of the contributors or your conceptual framework took into account the issue of class, and whether it played any role in terms of which actors were more favorable in terms of working or cooperating with the European Union, whether it was a relevant concept to look at, whether it is part of an intersectional analysis in your book. And I also was wondering whether we need a new politics in terms of gender promotion on a universal scale, because when we are using the language of promotion, it implies that Europe is the origin, and then the developments or the concepts or the achievements originate from Europe, and then they are diffused elsewhere. And this is actually part of a Eurocentric understanding of European politics in general and European external relations, because promotion as a concept is also power-laden. It assumes that one is a giver and the other one is a receiver. So I was wondering, maybe we should move away from the language of promotion to solidarity. Because solidarity as a concept also implies the possibility of learning from each other. And as a Turkish woman living in Europe in 15 years, I have the impression that we have things to learn from each other rather than an understanding of diffusionist politics. So I was wondering whether we need a different language, especially because you have also talked about the contradictions in EU gender equality, especially in recent years in countries like Poland and Hungary. But I don't think exceptionalizing Hungary and Poland is also very productive. I think we have serious issues in terms of gender equality in the so-called liberal democracies in the countries that we live. So my question is there a new politics possible?
Well, actually, that's a very good point, Beste. I mean, that's when we were, I mean, I was writing these chapters and all my years of work with different, like engagement with different feminist philosophers. And that's actually, that's what many philosophers and myself will argue, is that even in, like Western democracies, women are not seen as, partners of men, like, it's just like there's no sort of an equalities that exists. So whenever I argue, so my understanding of kind of feminism is much more rests on reconstruction of society and all the institutions in a way that, like we sort of disrupt these underlying hegemonic and male-centric power structures and concepts that it needs a complete reorder of a re-establishment of societies, which is quite difficult, and which is a like will be an unfinished job, like even 100 years from now, when we may still live in a society where we women are, you know, like living under the illusion of gender equality. I mean, even in the UK here, you know, there's just like this, you see this illusionality of gender equality on many levels. And this illusion of gender equality, as you said, is manifests different selves for different women. The class, race, ethnicity, they're all important factors. And in our analysis, no, unfortunately, we didn't, you know, like focus on the class issues. I mean, our focus was much more understanding how those policies are being reformed and whose interest those policies are, you know, like referring. Then, of course, there's a clear answer that even in Turkey, those policies are best of interest of the, you know, like of middle class, upper middle class, you know, like women with higher education degrees and so on. We, you know, probably what I'm talking about. But this, as you said, manifests themselves in different ways, and it needs this kind of an intersectionality in how we approach it. I mean, in the book, we at some point, you know, talk about if, you know, gender equality is a basic concept, you know, then we need to make a distinction about how, you know, a white French woman and a black French woman use this right. And it's the same in Turkey as well, you know, like now, if you look into, I know that they're not under the category of citizenship, but a Syrian woman or a Turkish woman or a woman of different ethnicity or, you know, like can make of these rights. So we don't go into these debates, although we just like sort of pinpoint it, but these are the, you know, like, issues I think we need to deal with at a much deeper level, because these are what, you know, like governs the way that we should form the policies. You know, we often form the policies on this dichotomist understanding, you know, woman versus man, but also in the book, we also at some point acknowledge that women also exercise power on each other. Women discriminate each other. So there's also, you know, like woman to woman, that kind of, you know, gender inequality that exists. That not every woman is sort of equal in terms of opportunities they reach out. And this actually takes us back to where I mentioned in the 4th chapter is the on our own nails argument about the concept of coercion and also consent, because this is actually a non-idealized abstraction of justice, which accounts for the identification of deception and coercion of the rights. And therefore, the legitimacy here should be sort of questioned, because the importance of understanding this, how different the intersectionality takes place and how different women use, you know, like the rights available to them is actually important in understanding the, you know, like how we can ensure policies and directives, you know, favor or address marginalized voices, for instance, poor women or women of marginalized ethnic communities, because such women may rely on others and not have independence, and they may not be able to set their own terms, which may effectively force them to accept the proposals of the more powerful. So this kind of, you know, like unidealized abstraction of justice is one of the things that in feminist philosophy we should really look into as we devise this kind of gender policies. So Rahima, I'll just like leave it to you now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Melis. Rahima, do you want to also react to it?
Yes, very briefly about the class issue. If any chapters have addressed, you asked. That's an important question that we were looking. We opened the gate actually for this in chapter 4, and we encouraged our contributors to touch upon that. But I think briefly, Gamze Yıldız Şeren Kurular's chapter on gender responsive budgeting have touched upon this, although not very explicitly talked about these women who are benefiting from women programs organized by the municipality, and but making no impact in their lives. And apart from that, there was actually a chapter from Burcu Taşkın, Burcu Taşkın's chapter on political representation. I think I remember her touching upon the consent of women that they received, and not representing the woman that they actually get the consent from. And very briefly, and about your question about taking Europe as the origin of like reframing, having this language. This is a very valid question, and as I said before, I mean, this is a new passion that I have. But yes, our departing point is that, you know, that it is, the literature says that it is an important actor. And by the way, we have also written a blog piece on reflecting our findings in Turkish. And somebody asked us, why do you call this even an actor? Which is a question that I never thought of. Why don't you call this actress? Why this is gender? We didn't think of that. But yeah, we were thinking with Melis actually on the way about this Europeanization. But yes, the departure point we take, but this is also the rationale that, you know, we want to explore, that we identify from the literature that, you know, the EU is successful in a certain extent, and it fails at some point, and why this is one that it fails. And I think for this kind of question, yeah, I think we have to focus on, although I agree with you totally about the Eurocentrism, and yeah, we just wanted to innovate a little bit on like how it could be better. It has the potential, it's progressive, but then how it could actually evolve to promote better gender equality, and also the language of promotion and solidarity. Yeah. I don't know if I can answer this question at the moment. Yes, solidarity would be really good, but I mean, I think we are not yet there yet in terms of like, we should achieve, like the first woman who made these positions, they have actually entered these rooms and the positions by displaying certain kind of attributes, masculinity, and then further efforts have been built on them. And so maybe I'm hoping that one day we will stop talking about promotion and let's do it together. So it's an invitation for all of you.
We need feminist state. Feminist state.
Exactly. Yeah, well, we have reached the end of our time. I would like to thank Rahime, Melis, and Hanna. That was an excellent discussion, and I have enjoyed very much, and I look forward to reading the book. I would like to also thank the audience for being with us today. And this is an excellent series, and there are more events coming up. You can visit the website of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies or follow the Twitter account to get updates about the upcoming events. And this video has been recorded, and in a few days it will be available on the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, and it will definitely be included into my syllabus. I am teaching EU politics. It is conceptually and empirically so rich, and it will definitely add to our class discussions. And also follow ACE's social media accounts for events in other online series. Thank you once again, and hope to see you on site for another event. And I wish all of you a wonderful evening. See you soon.
Thank you very much.